Hello, my name's Brodie McLeod, and if you've got the misfortune to sit through another 30 or 40 minutes of one of my YouTube videos, which are getting seriously big on the internet now, we're getting sort of 8 to 12 views, sometimes even up to 18 views, 15 views. So, I mean, I'm looking forward to being multi-trillionaire by this time next year, just from the advertising revenue from YouTube alone, really. Nothing to do with the estate of a kind of West German politician or anything like that, but like what I'm talking about really today is mental health in its sort of various different amalgams and contraindications and things that are treatment resistant, issues like institutionalization and also resistance. So you get a lot of people who spend ages in hospital. Some people I met in Ramsey Ward in Cygnet, Essex, Cygnet, Colchester. They've been in hospital for like 12 years, 5 years, like 3 years, and they still hadn't changed their opinion of the world or their viewpoint. They were still adamant that X incident had happened, and they weren't about to sort of like come up with a plausible narrative, a little bit like Sarah Connor in Terminator 2, you know, in order to be compliant enough to be released, you know. And I think there's a saying, like, you know, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not after you. Like, you get people who owe money to drug dealers who turn up at A&E and say, I'm having a mental breakdown, someone's trying to kill me, you know, I need to go into a psychiatric ward. Then the NHS has to sort of like, you know, play ball with that quite a lot, because it's like, if you look at the story of like people like Adolf Hitler, he, as the official narrative goes, took a cyanide tablet and shot himself in the head, right? And that wasn't because he was mentally ill. It wasn't because he was depressed or sad or miserable or delusional or he had a chemical imbalance in his neurological makeup. It's because he was fucked. Because he knew he was absolutely fucked. It turns out it wasn't fucked. He escaped, and you know, I wouldn't be sat here today if it wasn't for that. But I'd probably be speaking German too. But you know. Dich, nein, der Problem schmieg. Treib Sport und völlig besser. I can't speak German, but like, I'm fat. And I don't know really. My kind of outlook on mental health, psychiatric medicine, psychology, psychiatry, occupational therapy. There's lots of treatments which get offered to people in hospital, but including the pharmacological model of antipsychotics, which just make you really fat like me. When I used to have a beautiful six-pack, and now I weigh 125 kilos. I was 80 kilos, and built very well. I might even show you some pictures, look, just to be a ponce. Let's go to photos, right, and just, how do we search? So this is what I looked like in 2018, like 2019. I was in like peak physical fitness before I started on the depot. I was really quite well and healthy, and certainly didn't have a sort of like a really big problem with being overweight, you know, at all. I was extremely physically fit. Yeah, if you look at some of these photos, you can see I was very well toned. I was agile, I was very strong, I was very quick. Yeah, I mean, you can see all of these. It's not what I look like anymore, you know. I don't look like that anymore. I look like a fat shit because I've been on antipsychotic depots, which are the names for injections, for ages. I've got jiggly wiggly boobs that jiggle as I walk down the stairs, and actually, apparently, according to the doctor, even lactate. So like, they are actually boobs. So anyway, mental health system's a bit fucked up. It doesn't really help people that much. Medicines don't always work. Institutions where they keep people for years don't make them any better. And the food they eat is integral to their recovery, but gets completely overlooked. So you've got several subjects there which I'm going to delve into today. And I invite you to join me on another boring video, which is purely AI content with a sort of fairly astute and amiable prompt that I've constructed in order to provide a deep research paper, which is entitled Psychiatric Treatment Models and Alternatives. So the illusion of the chemical cure, phenomenological realities, institutional failures, and the paradigm shift in psychiatric care. This is for informational purposes only. For medical advice or diagnosis, consult a professional. I'm not a professional, I'm a psychiatric patient. The architecture of modern mental health care rests upon a foundation that is quietly but irreversibly fracturing. For the better part of the century, the dominant narrative surrounding severe mental illness such as schizophrenia, treatment-resistant depression, and profound psychosis has been anchored firmly within the allopathic biomedical model. This paradigm posits an alluringly simple premise: psychological distress is the mechanical byproduct of a chemical imbalance within the brain, a quantifiable deficit or surplus of neurotransmitters that can be diagnosed in a single brief encounter and corrected with a daily psychotropic pill. When this medication inevitably fails for a substantial subset of patients, the default systematic response has historically been institutionalization, the sequestration of the individual from society into psychiatric wards for long-term care facilities or long-term care facilities. Yet a rigorous examination of the phenomenological reality of mental illness, combined with emerging gastrointestinological science and longitudinal sociological data, reveals a starkly different truth. The chemical imbalance theory, once sold to the public as an infallible biological fact, is increasingly viewed by researchers as a reductive myth born of mid-century pharmacological accidents. Furthermore, the over-reliance on 30-minute psychiatric consultations to prescribe powerful antipsychotic belies the profound multidimensional complexities of the human mind. As the medical community begins to grapple with the catastrophic limitations of long-term psychiatric incarceration, a process that often includes a social death rather than genuine rehabilitation, the paradigm shift is underway from the historic legislation of psychedelic-assisted therapies in Australia to the biological revelation that human gut functions as a literal second brain. The future of anti-psychiatric care demands a radical departure from the coercive, pharmaceutically dependent models of the past. The phenomenology of psychosis and the treatment-resistant mind. I'm going to quickly have a take of my vape because I'm muddling my words up because of my meds. That's better. To understand the failure of the current psychiatric model, one must first understand the lived experience, the phenomenology of the illnesses it attempts to treat. Psychosis is perhaps the most ineffable and alienating existential experience a human being can endure, representing not merely a collection of checklist symptoms, but a profound rupture in an individual's vital contact with reality. Phenomenological research reveals that the early stages of psychosis, often termed the prodromal stage, characterized by a terrifying loss of common sense and a feeling of intense, paralyzing perplexity. The mid-20th century German psychiatrist Klaus Conrad famously described this initial expectation phase as the term tremor, or stage fright. During the tremor, the individual is grappled by a delusional mood, whatever that says, among an uncanny, oppressive sense of tension, where familiar places become menacing, faces lose their familiarity, and time feels suspended, as if some ominous event is perpetually about to recur. As the illness progresses into the first acute episode, the dissolution of the self is often accompanied by a tumultuous internal noise, intense self-referentiality, and the terrifying inclusion of hallucinations. For patients, these hallucinations do not abstract clinical data points to be charted on a medical record. They are experienced as extra perceptions that intrude upon shared reality, causing profound disorientation, fear, and a desperate desire to escape or isolate away from others. The biomedical model promises that antipsychotic medications will silence this internal cases. For many, however, the promise remains unfulfilled. Treatment resistance is a clinical designation applied when an illness does not respond to adequate courses of standard pharmacological therapies. In the realm of schizophrenia, approximately 1/3 of patients show little to no improvement, with first-line antipsychotics continuing to suffer from disorganized thinking, delusions, and severe negative symptoms such as avolition and affective flattening. For these individuals, the gold standard allopathic treatment is clozapine. Yet even among those prescribed with this powerful atypical antipsychotic, between 40 and 70% eventually meet the criteria for clozapine-resistant schizophrenia. So, auspiciously, it doesn't work. The phenomenology of treatment resistance is singularly devastating. Patients internalize the failure of the medication, often experiencing profound hopelessness, helplessness, and a shattered sense of self-esteem. The clinical label of being treatment resistant can feel like a life sentence, shifting the blame from an inadequate medical paradigm onto the perceived biological failings of the patient. Instead of investigating the complex psychosocial drivers of the distress, the medical system frequently interprets resistance as a mandate for increased dosage or ultimately institutionalization for those that are on community treatment orders in the community. The mythos of the infallible chemical imbalance. To comprehend how modern psychiatry arrived at a point where patients are subtly blamed for failing to respond to medication, one must trace the history of the chemical imbalance theory. Today, approximately 90% of the general public in Western countries believes that depression and related psychiatric disorders are caused by literal imbalance of chemicals, such as serotonin, norepinephrine, or dopamine in the brain. This theory is frequently presented as an infallible, established scientific fact, akin to the mechanism of infectious diseases. However, the chemical imbalance theory was not the result of a fundamental, groundbreaking discovery about neuroscience of mental illness. Rather, it was a post hoc hypothesis constructed to explain the side effects of medications discovered entirely by accident during the mid-20th century. So the origin of this story is deeply rooted in serendipity. In 1952, the Seaview Hospital in Staten Island, New York, clinical trials were underway for a new experimental tuberculosis drug called ipronazid. The hospital was a tuberculosis sanatorium staffed largely by a dedicated group of black nurses known as the Black Angels, who cared for marginalized patients dying of consumption in an era of intense racial segregation and medical peril. During the administration of ipronazid, the nurses and doctors noticed a miraculous side effect. The gravely ill, lethargic patients were suddenly euphoric, exhibiting renewed vitality, restored appetites, and even dancing in the hospital corridors. Researchers soon discovered that ipronazid functioned as a monoamine oxidase (MAO) inhibitor, which prevented the enzymatic breakdown of chemical messages like serotonin and norepinephrine in the brain. Almost simultaneously in Switzerland, a psychiatrist named Roland Kuhn was testing a failed antihistamine called imipramine on patients with schizophrenia at the Munster, England Psychiatric Hospital, where imipramine failed to alleviate psychotic symptoms. Kuhn noticed that through careful, albeit unstructured, clinical observation, that it profoundly elevated the mood of the severely depressed patients, leading to birth of tricyclical antidepressants. Because these accidental drugs happen to raise monoamine levels in the brain, scientists reverse engineered a hypothesis. If raising serotonin and norepinephrine cures depression, then depression therefore must be caused by the lack of these chemicals. Thus, the monoamine hypothesis was born. So the pharmacological agent, those two drugs, originally intended for the use of this, and found that actually they induced euphoria, vitality, and depression. And from that point of view, we had monoamine hypothesis on the basis of tricyclic antidepressants and other drugs that address imbalances in your brain that nobody ever actually did any research on. They just found out that you could lower and raise serotonin with these two drugs, and then associated all mental illnesses with norepinephrine, dopamine, and serotonin, and then found medicines that they felt affected all of these, and moreover applied to sort of detracted science that they all therefore needed them. After a 30-minute conversation, you can tell someone's got a sort of a medical imbalance in their brain, which is just absurd, really. It doesn't make any sense at all. There certainly isn't any research, available to fully show that phase 2 clinical trials, which I'm sure a lot of them have passed, but it's a sort of accidentally discovered premise that spiderwebbed and snowballed, and for decades the pharmaceutical industry and the psychiatric profession aggressively marketed the chemical imbalance theory, framing mental illness as a simple biological deficit akin to type 1 diabetic lacking insulin. It's an incredibly successful marketing strategy that removed some societal stigma by medicalising the distress whilst simultaneously creating massive multi-billion-dollar global market for selected serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, probably heard of those. The scientific foundation of the theory, however, was always fundamentally flawed. There are no reliable biological tests, blood draw, lumbar puncture, or brain scan that can measure a specific chemical imbalance in a living human brain to diagnose a psychiatric condition. The illusion of biological certainty culminated in 2022 when a landmark systemic umbrella review by Dr. Joanne Moncrief and colleagues definitively dismissed the serotonin theory of depression. The comprehensive review analysed decades of research and found no consistent evidence linking serotonin levels, serotonin metabolites, serotonin receptors, or serotonin transporter binding to depression. Furthermore, experiments that deliberately depleted tryptophan, the amino acid precursor to serotonin, in healthy volunteers consistently failed to induce depression. The revelation that the chemical imbalance theory is empirically unsupported possesses a profound existential challenge to standard allopathic psychiatry. Psychiatric drugs do not correct underlying biochemical diseases, rather they alter normal brain states, acting more as psychoactive substances that blunt emotions or suppress the central nervous system, rather than acting as targeted cures for biological deficits. Despite this, the myth persists, perpetuated by rushed clinical practices that rely heavily on the prescription pad. The absurdity of the 30-minute diagnosis. If mental illnesses cannot be traced to measurable chemical imbalances using that equipment, the diagnostic mechanisms used by modern psychiatry invite intense critical scrutiny. In the contemporary medical landscape, particularly in Western nations heavily influenced by managed care and insurance reimbursement models, psychiatric intake and medication management have been brutally compressed. It is increasingly common for a patient to receive a life-altering diagnosis of schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or major depressive disorder following a mere 30-minute consultation with a psychiatrist. During these brief encounters, clinicians rely on subjective conversational cues and rating scales such as Positive and Negative Syndrome Scale, PANSS, or the Brief Psychiatric Rating Scale, BPRS, to quantify human suffering into neat billing codes. There is a glaring lack of peer-reviewed evidence to suggest that a 30-minute interview can accurately deduce the presence of a neurochemical abnormality requiring lifelong antipsychotic treatment that these guys prescribe after your ward round, which takes 30 minutes. The induction of structured clinical interviews, such as the structured clinical interview for DSM-4 SCID, was an attempt to improve diagnostic reliability, forcing the chaotic presentation of mental distress into a highly operationalized criteria. However, critics argue that these structured interviews strip away the context of the patient's life, relying heavily on self-reporting and ignoring the phenomenological depth of the illness. When elevated in naturalistic clinical settings, structured interviews often show surprisingly poor diagnostic treatment compared to longitudinal consensus-based assessments. The distinction between diagnostic reliability, the ability of two doctors to agree on a label based on a checklist, and diagnostic validity, whether the label actually represents a distinct biological disease entity, is a cornerstone of this critique. While successful iterations of diagnostic manuals have improved the reliability of diagnosis, the validity of constructs like schizophrenia remain highly contested, as symptoms frequently overlap across diverse conditions. The profound vulnerability of the psychiatric diagnosis process to situational bias was laid bare by the famous Rosen experiment in 1973. In this study, healthy Confederates faking a single vague symptom, hearing a voice say thud, empty or hollow, were readily admitted to psychiatric hospitals and diagnosed with schizophrenia. Once admitted, they acted completely normally, yet the psychiatric staff consistently interpreted their normal behaviour through the lens of their diagnosis, demonstrating how the institutional context creates a self-fulfilling prophecy of pathology. When a psychiatrist prescribes a heavy regimen of antipsychotics after a brief 30-minute consultation, they're not correcting a verified biological defect. They're making an educated guess based on the phenotypic cluster of symptoms, relying on a model of chemical suppression to alleviate distress, often at the cost of severe physiological side effects. Allopathic remedies, chemical leashes, and the carceral reality of institutionalization. So when rapid pharmacological interventions fail to yield compliance or symptom remission, the traditional allopathic model defaults to containment. Historically, this meant indefinite inpatient psychiatric admission. Today, the carceral reality of mental health care exists on a spectrum, ranging from long-term ward segregation to highly coercive community management programs. In 1961, the Canadian sociologist Irving Goffman published Asylums, a foundational text that defined the psychiatric hospital as a total institution. Goffman argued that places like psychiatric wards, prisons, and monasteries operate by cutting individuals off from wider society and subjecting them to an enclosed, formally administered, and strictly regimented round of life. Upon entering a total institution, the patient undergoes a mortification of the self, a systematic stripping of their personal identity, possessions, autonomy, and social roles, which are rapidly replaced by the stigmatized label of patient or inmate. Goffman posited that much of the bizarre or institutionalized behavior observed in psychiatric wards was not a symptom of underlying illness itself, but rather a direct psychological adaptation to the coercive, dehumanizing environment of the hospital. Over 6 decades later, long-term psychiatric institutionalization continues to demonstrate a catastrophic lack of therapeutic efficacy. A 2023 report commissioned by the UK government, chaired by Baroness Hollins, reviewed that the care of individuals with complex needs detained in long-term segregation. The findings were a damning indictment of carceral psychiatry. So the overall panel found that absolutely no therapeutic benefit to solitary confinement or long-term segregation for mental health patients. Instead, isolation predictably exacerbated anxiety, worsened mental distress, and provoked the very challenging behaviours that justified the confinement in the first place, creating an inescapable self-perpetuating cycle. I kicked a door off a hinges the other day and smashed up a kitchen door because I was fucking furious at the apoplectic rage I'd been whipped up into by staff and the service users at that point, you know. And that's because I've been in hospital for 2 years, not because I like destroying furniture or bits of wood. Patients subjected to lengthy admissions frequently experience a phenomenon akin to social death. Stripped of agency and isolated from their communities, individuals lose vital life skills, social connections, and the ability to engage in independent thought. Research indicates that prolonged institutional confinement actually exacerbates cognitive impairments and linguistic deficits such as alogia, that's the poverty of speech, severely hindering the potential for genuine rehabilitation and community reintegration. Furthermore, mortality rates among discharged long-stay psychiatric patients remains alarmingly high, driven by the physical toll of prolonged psychotropic medication use, sedentary ward lifestyles, and systematic institutional neglect. Then you've got the illusion of community care, ACT and CTOs. In response to the ethical and financial failures of mass institutionalisation, modern psychiatry developed allopathic strategies aimed at keeping patients in the community. Prominent among these crisis resolution and home treatment (CHRT) teams and assertive community treatment (ACT) models. These programs were designed to provide intensive mobile psychiatric care to individuals experiencing acute crises or those with a history of frequent hospitalizations. While these models initially showed promise in reducing hospital bed days, their long-term efficacy and ethical foundations are increasingly questioned. Studies indicate that while ACT and CRHT models may reduce hospitalizations for high-frequency users, they often fail substantially to improve clinical symptoms, social functioning, or overall quality of life when compared to standard care. More critically, these community models frequently operate as a form of carceral psychiatry extended into the home, so patients are often subjected to involuntary outpatient commitments or community treatment orders which legally mandate compliance with medication regimens. Critics and patient advocates have sharply characterised these legally enforced pharmacological regimens as a chemical leash, tethering the individual to the psychiatric system through a constant threat of re-hospitalisation if they refuse their medication. Rather than fostering genuine rehabilitation or addressing the psychological roots of the individual's distress, the chemical leash approach priorities behavioural control and risk management, effectively transforming the patient's own home into an extension of the total institution. The hypocrisy of hospital nutrition, completely separate issue but relevant. So the physical environment of the psychiatric institution not only deprives patients of autonomy, it actively compromises their physiological health. The most glaringly evident in the standard of nutrition provided to psychiatric patients. As a scientific understanding of the gut-brain axis accelerates, the abysmal quality of hospital food is no longer merely a matter of comfort, it represents a systemic medical failure. Audits of hospital food in the UK and Australia consistently reveal meals that are highly processed, low in dietary fibre, and stripped of the complex nutrients required to support neurological health. The Care Quality Commission in the UK has historically highlighted these severe deficiencies in hospital nutrition, noting that patients are frequently denied the dignity of proper assistance with meals, while the food itself fails to meet basic dietary standards. Patients in psychiatric wards routinely report that hospital food lacks flavour, presentation, and most importantly, nutritional variety, leading to significant malnutrition and even people just skipping their meals. And a crucial medical irony, patients in long-term psychiatric care are frequently prescribed heavy polypharmaceutical doses of atypical antipsychotics. These medications are notorious for causing severe metabolic dysfunction, extreme weight gain, and ravenous cravings for refined carbohydrates and sugars. Confining these patients to an environment that serves highly processed, obscenogenic institutional food is a recipe for disaster. The combination destroys the gut flora, induces chronic neuroinflammation, and practically guarantees worsening physical health and mental health, fundamentally undermining the purported goals of psychiatric rehabilitation. The gut-brain axis, not many people know about this. You might find this interesting if you're watching this far, 30 minutes into this bullshit video. To the gut-brain axis, the second brain in the stomach, the profound relevance of dietary health to mental illness becomes clear when one examines the most transformative paradigm shift in modern neuroscience, the exploration of the microbiota gut-brain axis. This bidirectional biochemical signaling network connects the gastrointestinal tract to the central nervous system, fundamentally rewrites the etiology of psychiatric distress. Traditional psychiatric care operates on the deeply flawed assumption that mental illness is entirely cephalic, located exclusively within the skull. Yet, the human gastrointestinal tract is lined with enteric nervous system (ENS), an astonishingly complex neural network that operates with a high degree of autonomy, often referred to in popular science as the body's second brain. The ENS contains approximately 500 million neurons. To put this staggering figure into perspective, the human gut contains roughly 5 times as many neurons as the human spinal cord and boasts a neural complexity equivalent to the entire brain of a small mammal, such as a Yorkshire Terrier or a cat. This vast enteric neural network utilizes more than 30 neurotransmitters that are identical to those found in the brain. Crucially, the gut acts as the body's primary factory for mood-regulating chemicals. Approximately 90% of the body's serotonin, the exact neurotransmitter targeted by decades of failed antidepressant therapies, is synthesized not in the brain, but in the enterochromaffin cells of gastrointestinal tract. Similarly, roughly 50% of the body's dopamine is produced in the gut. There's a table I can't bother to read. Through the vagus nerve, the enteric nervous system transmits constant sensory information about the state of the microbiome directly to the brain. Gut bacteria metabolize dietary components such as tryptophan into indole derivatives and short-chain fatty acids, which circulate systematically cross the blood-brain barrier and regulate neuroinflammation and heavily modulate central nervous system activity. So pretty bad. The emerging field of nutritional psychiatry argues that any genuine treatment for depression or schizophrenia must include diet optimization, such as Mediterranean-style diets rich in omega-3 fatty acids, fiber, and prebiotics to heal the gut-brain axis, ignoring the biological reality that 90% of serotonin is manufactured in the stomach, while simultaneously prescribing SSRIs and feeding patients highly processed institutional food is a glaring systematic contradiction. So the psychedelic frontier, Australia's regulatory leap. While national psychiatry seeks to heal the biological foundations of the mind via the gut, another radical approach is addressing the profound psychological trauma that traditional antipsychotics and chemical leashes merely suppress. For decades, psychoactive substances like MDMA and psilocybin were criminalized, effectively halting rigorous research into their profound therapeutic potential. However, in a historic and unprecedented move, Australia's Therapeutic Goods Administration became the first national regulatory body in the world to officially recognise these psychedelics as legitimate medicines. On July the 1st, 23, TGA rescheduled MDMA and psilocybin from Schedule 9, prohibited illicit substances, to Schedule 8, controlled medicines. Under the highly regulated authorised prescriber AP scheme, specially approved psychiatrists can now prescribe MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for post-traumatic stress disorder and psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy for treatment-resistant depression. The legislation of psychedelic-assisted therapy in Australia represents a philosophical earthquake in psychiatric medicine. Traditional allopathic medicines almost exclusively on a chronic dosing model. The patient takes a pill every day indefinitely to suppress or manage symptoms. Psychedelic therapy, conversely, operates on a catalyst model, so the pharmacological agent is administered only by a handful of times within a highly controlled, deeply therapeutic setting, accompanied by an intensive preparatory and integration psychotherapy. The drugs act as a profound catalyst, facilitating a state of extreme neuroplasticity and emotional openness. MDMA dampens the amygdala's fear response, allowing individuals with severe treatment-resistant PTSD to revisit and process deeply entrenched traumatic memories without being overwhelmed by panic. Psilocybin has been shown to temporarily dissolve rigid ruminative neural networks associated with the default mode network, allowing the depressed brain to effectively reset and form new, healthier connections. The TGA's decision to leap ahead of the rest of the world was heavily influenced by the sheer scale of the mental health epidemic and the undeniable failure of existing pharmacological treatments to provide lasting relief. While the rollout in Australia may have been inherently cautious, expensive and limited by the strict government for human research and ethics committee approvals, it signifies a monumental government acknowledgement that the daily dosing symptom suppression model of psychiatry is fundamentally inadequate. Then you've got radical relational alternatives, so soteria and open dialogue. If the chemical imbalance theory is inherently bankrupt, 30-minute diagnostic consultations are invalid, long-term psychiatric incarceration causes social death, and community treatment orders act merely as chemical leashes, what is the alternative for individuals experiencing acute psychosis or schizophrenia? The answer lies in dismantling the coercive structures of the total institution and embracing relational, community-based models of care that tolerate the profound uncertainty of psychosis without immediately resorting to chemical suppression. So you've got the soteria paradigm. Developed in the 1970s, American psychiatrist Dr. Lauren Mosher, and the soteria model provides a radical, deeply humanistic alternative to acute psychiatric hospitalization. Soteria houses are small, community-based residential facilities staffed primarily by non-medical personnel, often peers or individuals selected for their empathy and institution. You focus on being with the parent during a psychotic crisis, I should have said there. I'm very tired. Rather than doing to them from a position of clinical authority. So the soteria approach is phenomenological. It views the psychosis not as a meaningless biological disease to be eradicated, but as a subjective, deeply meaningful crisis of the self that can be worked through. Crucially, residents rarely given the antipsychotic drugs during the initial weeks of their stay, completely circumventing the standard allopathic reliance on immediate neuroleptic loading. So research comparing the soteria models to standard hospital treatments indicates that soteria yields equal and in several specific areas superior long-term outcomes in treating first episode schizophrenia. These facilities achieve symptom remission with significantly less medication, lower overall costs, and drastically reduced trauma and stigma for the patient, proving that acute psychosis can be safely managed. So yeah, they had to have a knock on my door then, so I'll start from the top. I can't remember where it was. The soteria approach is phenomenological. It views psychosis not as a meaningless biological disease to be eradicated, but as subjective, deeply meaningful crisis of the self that can be worked through. Crucially, Residents are rarely given antipsychotic drugs during the initial weeks of their stay, completely circumventing the standard allopathic reliance on immediate neuroleptic loading. Research comparing Sotira models to standard hospital treatment indicates that the Sotira yields equal and, in severe specific areas, superior long-term outcomes in treating first episode schizophrenia. These facilities achieve symptom remission with significantly less medication, lower overall costs, and drastically reduced trauma and stigma for the patient, proving that acute psychosis can be safely managed in a non-coercive environment. So the open dialogue approach. Similarly, revolutionary is the open dialogue approach, originally developed in Western Lapland, Finland. Open dialogue fundamentally restructures the psychiatric emergency response system. So when an individual experiences a mental health crisis, open dialogue mandates an immediate mobile network meeting involving the patient, their family, and their broader social support systems, ideally occurring within 24 hours of the crisis. Instead of an expert-led diagnostic interview aimed at rapidly prescribing medication to correct a presumed chemical imbalance, open dialogue creates a polyphonic, multi-voiced space where the terrifying, ineffable experience of psychosis can be given language and shared meaning within the patient's own community. The approach relies heavily on a tolerance of uncertainty, deliberately avoiding premature clinical decisions, diagnosis, or the rapid initiation of pharmacological treatments. The longitudinal outcomes of open dialogue are staggering. Studies in Finland demonstrate that over 82% of patients treated with open dialogue have no residual psychotic symptoms at a 5-year follow-up. The vast majority, 86%, return to full-time employment or study. Most incredibly, 29% of these patients ever require the use of neuroleptic medication, a figure that's virtually unheard of in Western allopathic psychiatry, where lifelong medication is considered mandatory for psychotic disorders. Conclusion: the mandate for a new paradigm. The phenomenology of severe mental illness is an agonizing reality for millions, but the dominant medical and institutional response has too often compounded rather than alleviated this profound human suffering. The rigid adherence to a pharmacological model predicated on the debunked chemical imbalance theory and executed through the dangerous absurdity of hasty 30-minute consultations has created a global epidemic of treatment-resistant, heavily medicated individuals. When these patients inevitably fail to respond to medications designed for non-existent chemical deficits, they're exiled to psychiatric wards or subjected to the chemical leash of community treatment orders. Inside these total institutions, they endure the mortification of self, languishing environments that deprive them of agency and serve nutrient-poor diets that actively destroy the delicate gut-brain axis, further destabilizing the 500 million neurons in their enteric nervous system. An urgent systemic overhaul is required. True rehabilitation cannot occur within the punitive walls of a total institution, nor can it be found solely at the end of a prescription pad. The future of psychiatric care must be integrative, rational, and deeply respectful of human phenomenology. It requires embracing the gastrointestinal realities of the second brain by prioritizing dietary health as frontline medicine. It necessitates expanding access to legally regulated paradigm-shifting catalyst treatments like MDMA and psilocybin, and most importantly, it demands a transition towards compassionate, community-based frameworks such as Soerta houses and open dialogue, where that view the patient not as the broken chemical machine to be sedated, but as a human being navigating a profound existential crisis, deserving the presence of dignity and authentic healing. Tell me what you think on a postcard at P.O. Box, Dripping Goat's Penis 1234, and you could win yourself tickets to Thorpe Park if you're lucky. Thanks.